economist, thinker, observer. There is practically everything that one can associate with the persona of Prabhat Patnaik. And I didn't want to start it off on that note, but I just can't resist the temptation. Looking at whatever is happening in West Bengal today, I was just reminded of an article that he had written before the West Bengal Legislative Assembly elections about the voting trends and how unhistorical they might be in the context in which the voting was taking place. And well, people didn't heed it at that point of time. But I think his prescience has borne out whatever has been happening in that state ever since the elections have taken place. So that prescient and observer of contemporary events, that sharp author of things, is orator for the evening that we have got to talk on an absolutely interesting topic. The formalities of introducing him would start off by mentioning this, that he joined St. Stephen's College in Delhi for his BA Honours program. His MA Honours program, his MA program, which was taught at the Delhi School of Economics and which discussed the theoretical problems with neoclassical economics in a more sophisticated manner, introduced him to Keynes and Harrod. The Delhi School of Economics at that time had a galaxy of distinguished economists, of whom he was specially influenced by Amartya Sen, Sukhmay Chakravarti and K.N. Raj. In 1966, he got a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford. He joined Balliol for a BPhil in economics and moved to Newfield after a year. He started his doctoral work there, though he was to submit it later from Cambridge. Oxford contributed to his formation in two ways. First, there was at that time a very rich tradition of developmental economics at Oxford, which was an eye-opener for someone like him, who had known India, who had known only about India till then. Secondly, his stay there coincided with the worldwide upsurge of student radicalism in the context of the May 1968 movements in Europe, which threw him into the company of some exceptionally bright fellow students, mostly from other disciplines, and forced him to develop some acquaintance with these disciplines. He also got acquainted with a large body of classical and contemporary Marxist literature and generally with the history of socialism. After the expiry of his Rhodes Scholarship in 1969, he got a junior faculty position at Cambridge and a fellowship at Clare College. Returned to India in 1974 to teach at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He retired from the center in 2006, and between 2006 and 2011, he served as the Vice Chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board. His research work over the years has covered three main areas. The first relates to the dynamics of a mixed economy of the type that India was prior to the structural adjustment programs of the 1990s. The second area which has interested him is the theory of imperialism. His third strand of research has been in the area of Marxist theory. His economic researchers have only confirmed him in his view that socialism is necessary for the progress of mankind. And since the socialist third world cannot coexist with an aggrandizing capitalist first world, its general necessity for an equitable and just world order is inescapable. Socialism does not mean a return to or a replication of what prevailed in the Soviet Union or in the Eastern Europe earlier, which was a hastily erected structure in response to the acute crisis of capitalism between 1913 and 1951 that got ossified. To embrace capitalism because of dissatisfaction with that socialist experiment would be unhistorical and even callous. The alternative trajectory of reform constitutes, in his view, a first step in a long transition towards socialism, which can come only as a continuous process of the deepening of democracy. And it's precisely these concerns which are related to the deepening of democratic cultures, on account of which we decided that it would be completely in context of whatever we were planning as part of perspectivizing on 20 years of economic reforms in India, that we decided that we have got to invite him for the same. And it was absolutely stunning to get a confirmation from him in the positive that he would be coming and talking to all of us. So good, we are for an absolutely engaging evening. Before that, I would call upon the director of Indian Academy, Mallar Patil, to present a bouquet to Prabhat Patnaik as a token of gratitude and appreciation. Now I would call upon Prabhat Patnaik to make this presentation. Thank you.
Friends, it's a pleasure and privilege to be back in Pune. I remember in 1977 when I had come here first to give a course of 5 lectures on the current state of Marxian economics. Professor Prabhat and I had travelled around quite a lot. He was kind enough not only to attend but also to take me around the city. So it's particularly pleasant for me that today, after the lapse of all this time, I again find him in the audience. Thank you very much for coming. Basically, when we talk about the capitalist crisis, everybody means by it the recession. The crisis which is currently afflicting large numbers of advanced countries, including European economies, and that has captured the headlines. As a matter of fact, however, the capitalist crisis today is not one crisis, but 2 quite distinct crises. The much talked of crisis is the crisis of recession. But in addition to the crisis of recession, there is an acute world food crisis. And what I propose to discuss in the course of this lecture is that both these crises are owing to the same cause, which is rooted in the phenomenon of globalization. When I say world food crisis, let me begin by giving you some basic statistics that if you look at the world economy as a whole, then you find that the per capita cereal output, which prevailed, let us say, for the 5-year average between 1980 and 85, you compare it to the per capita cereal output for the 5-year average 2000 to 2005, you find that the per capita cereal output is lower in 2000-2005. Same is true of per capita food grains output. Now obviously, therefore, we have a situation where even though the world economy has registered a growth in this period, this growth has nonetheless been accompanied by an absolute decline in per capita food grain output and of course per capita food grain availability. It's not surprising that we actually find significant amount of growing hunger and malnutrition. These 2 crises, the crisis of recession, which produces unemployment, and the crisis of food, which produces hunger, are the 2 crises which really afflict much of mankind today. You may remember that the person who immolated himself at the beginning of the Tunisian revolution, which was the start of the Arab Spring, before immolating himself, he just made 2 slogans, food and employment. Therefore, what we find today is that on both these fronts, provision of food and provision of employment, we live in a world in which the economic system is really currently undergoing a massive crisis. Question arises, why is there a food crisis at all? The usual belief which many people would have is that this is a Ricardian crisis. By that I mean the following. The David Ricardo, writing in 1920, had said that, look, basically the land that is available for food production tends to get exhausted. As population keeps increasing, the demand for food rises. As the demand for food rises, more and more land is drawn into production of food, and when you reach the limits of it, or if you get increasingly inferior quantities of land, then obviously you have per capita food grain output declining. Now that's what I mean by a Ricardian explanation of the food crisis, that in effect there is excessive and growing pressure of population on land. As a matter of fact, however, the current food crisis in the world economy is not a Ricardian crisis. It's not a Ricardian crisis because, as a matter of fact, in many places now, including in India, land is left fallow rather than being used for food production, because food production has simply become extremely unprofitable. As a matter of fact, it was a part of the Ricardian theory that if you have pressure of population on land that is increasing, If you therefore have per capita food grain production which is declining, then the scarcity of food grains would drive food grain prices up relative to other prices, and therefore you would have a shift in the terms of trade in favor of food grains and against, let us say, manufacturing. But prior to 2008, when food grain prices rising, and I'll discuss that rise in a moment, if you take the entire period from 1980s till the beginning of this century, then you find that terms of trade have been moving against cereals, against food grains. In fact, between 1980 and 2000, the terms of trade have moved against cereals in favor of manufacturing, if you take those terms of trade, by as much as 46%. So what we are discussing here is not a Ricardian crisis. We are not discussing here a crisis that arises because of scarcity of land. As a matter of fact, we are discussing here a crisis whose roots lie in social factors, a crisis in which what you find is that there is a squeeze on the producers of food which makes it unprofitable for them even to produce food, and which of course makes it quite impossible for many of them to continue simple reproduction, which is why you have substantial numbers of suicides and so on taking place in our country. Not just of course food producers, but agricultural producers generally. Now this, to my mind, is a crisis therefore which arises because of excessive squeeze on agricultural producers, and I would say petty producers generally. Because exactly what is happening to agricultural producers is also happening to the fishermen in Kerala. It's also happening to craftsmen in various places. All over the world, and certainly in our country, there is an acute crisis of petty production. Now, why is there a crisis of petty production? Typically, you would find that, of course, capitalist development tends to supplant petty production. And the fact that capitalist development does so, and this supplanting becomes particularly acute in periods of depression and so on. In 1930s depression, for instance, we know that the peasantry in India suffered enormously, got into debt. That was a very important reason in our country behind the radicalization of the peasantry. You know, if you look at the anti-colonial struggle in India, the anti-colonial struggle really took off in the 1930s because the peasantry joined this struggle in large numbers. As a result, in order to make it possible for the peasantry to join this struggle in large numbers, the anti-colonial struggle itself adopted a certain agenda. And that agenda was that after independence, the newly independent Indian state will protect, will promote, will defend, will secure petty production, including peasant production. And as a matter of fact, therefore, what you had is that the normal tendency of capitalism to supplant petty production was to an extent kept in check because of the intervention of the dirigist state. The dirigist regime, the statist regime, of course, was a regime that was run by a bourgeois state because it was defending capitalist property, capitalist relations. But nonetheless, it was a bourgeois state which defended petty production against the encroachment of capitalism, at least to a certain extent, through the following measures. Firstly, you had a situation where the peasantry was protected from international competition. There were quantitative restrictions on trade in agricultural goods. As a result, the vicissitudes of world price fluctuations did not affect the Indian peasants. You had a situation in which there was a massive extension of extension services. In other words, the state provided extension services all over the country. You had a situation where research and development under the aegis of the state threw up new kinds of varieties of seeds, for instance, which became popularized through the extension services that really covered the entire country because of state intervention. You had a situation where a comprehensive system of procurement at remunerative prices was put forward for 22 crops, food grains as well as certain kinds of cash crops. You had a system in which there was substantial increase in state investment in irrigation. In fact, in the colonial period, other than the canal colonies of the Punjab, there had been a systematic ignoring of irrigation. As a matter of fact, that ignoring was negated after independence. You had bank nationalization, which paved the way for the provision of subsidized credit to agriculture. You had a situation again when inputs were subsidized, not just credit but other inputs to the peasantry. And of course, when you look at not just agricultural production but others like handlooms and so on, you had a system of reservations. A whole lot of production was reserved for the handloom sector. Now that is the kind of thing which actually reflected, if you like, the dirigist regime, the post-independence regime, redeeming to an extent the pledge of the anti-colonial period that it is going to defend and promote and so on petty production. Obviously, not everybody was an equal beneficiary of it. We know that this created differentiation within the peasantry. The rich peasants did better, the poor peasants did not. But through all that, there was a regime which tended to protect petty producers in these particular ways. Now you find that every one of these is being reversed. You have a situation where now input prices are being raised, including the price of credit. Nominally, banks are still supposed to provide priority sector lending, but now you can even buy a scooter in the village and that gets categorized as priority sector lending. So, perforce, large segments of the peasantry are now turning to money lenders in order to obtain credit at interest rates which are extremely high. And the same is true of a lot of microfinance institutions which give loans, make loans available at extraordinarily high, exorbitant interest rates. Input prices are going up. In fact, I don't have to go further. The latest budget, which was presented just the other day, says that fertilizer subsidy and petroleum subsidy is going to be drastically cut, which basically means these prices are going to rise. Now, it's a separate matter whether fertilizer use is good or bad, but that's a separate issue. The fundamental thing is that within a certain production regime, this is going to raise input costs. You have now a situation where the Indian peasants are exposed to international competition. Fluctuations in international prices make themselves felt in terms of fluctuations in domestic prices. Public investment in irrigation and other rural infrastructure has really dropped drastically. Extension services have virtually disappeared. As a matter of fact, now you have direct approach by multinational seed companies, by multinational companies, through their agents, direct approach to the peasantry, not even mediated through the state, because the state mechanisms, which were mechanisms of extension services, have completely disappeared. Research and development, again under the aegis of the state, is something which has virtually come to a standstill. So you have, in all these ways, precisely the kind of support that the government gave or the state gave to petty production is support which is no longer being provided. Until very recently, until 2008, you even had a progressive tendency towards winding up of the procurement system, but on the other hand, after 2008 prices rising, that has really been kept in check. But even so, you have a general withdrawal of support by the state. And it's not surprising, this is happening everywhere. If this is happening everywhere, it's not surprising that agriculture, particularly food grain production, is not a profitable activity anywhere in the world. And that being the case, with the petty producers being squeezed, you have agrarian crisis everywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, many of the political phenomena that we witness are phenomena which are a reflection of the agrarian crisis. I'll just give you two examples. A lot of the radical governments which are getting elected in Latin America, for instance, in Bolivia, Evo Morales and so on, are getting elected on account of peasant discontent that takes a left-wing direction. Likewise, in Iran, for instance, the election of Ahmadinejad owes much to the fact of an agrarian crisis where the peasantry supports Ahmadinejad against the urban population. So it can take all kinds of different forms. The fact is, different political forms, but the fact is that you have a pervasive agrarian crisis, and this pervasive agrarian crisis is on account of the fact that the kind of support that petty producers, including the peasantry, enjoyed all over the third world in the immediate period after decolonization is no longer available to them. The question is why? And I think this is a crucial question. Why has all this happened? When we think of the state, typically we think of the state as an entity that in some sense stands above society, an entity that sometimes acts in favor of one particular class, sometimes acts in favor of another particular class, but it's an entity that is, as it were, trying to balance different class interests. The fact that it's doing so does not mean it's neutral, because after all, this balancing does take place within an overall regime of defense of capitalist property. So that, that's why one calls it a bourgeois state. But a bourgeois state does not mean that it just does everything that the bourgeoisie wants. A bourgeois state is one that, while on the whole defending capitalist property and defending the rules of the game under capitalism, nonetheless, is typically one which is seen as standing above the different classes and balancing their interests in various ways, sometimes acting even apparently to restrain capitalists in favor of the other classes, in favor of the workers, in favor of the peasants and so on, as I said, the post-colonial dirigist regime trying to do. Now I think with globalization, this nature of the state changes. And that's the basic point I want to really put across to you. Why does that happen? With globalization, typically what tends to happen is that the state is captured by what I would call international finance capital, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, and the corporate financial elite that is closely integrated with international finance capital. I'm therefore making 2 points. I'm making the point that the corporate financial elites in different countries, whether it's India, whether it is whatever, Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia or whatever, the corporate financial elite in the different countries tend to develop a certain commonality of interest and commonality of purpose. And they get integrated into an overall phenomenon, which I call finance capital, that gets globalized. And because it gets globalized, it moves internationally, and that's why I'm calling it international finance capital. Now, the evidence of this is obvious. In the United States, when the crisis struck, the Obama administration made $13 trillion available in order to bail out the financial system. Okay. It made it available in very many different ways in terms of guarantees and so on. Obama administration also put $700 billion as a bailout package for increasing employment. So for the people, $700 billion of fiscal deficit. As a matter of fact, in America, since state governments can't run fiscal deficits, and in a recession their income goes down because their tax revenue goes down, their expenditure goes down. If you look at the net stimulus that was there for promoting employment, that came to only about $400 billion. $400 billion for the people, $13 trillion for the financial sector. And yet there was massive opposition to this $400 billion. You would have seen that actually there was opposition, fiscal deficit must be cut and all the rest of it. So you have, the evidence that finance now wants to appropriate the state exclusively for itself is pretty clear and obvious. But the question is that finance always would have wanted to do it. or the corporate financial elite would always have wanted to do it. What's so new now? Why is it that suddenly they are more successful? The reason they are more successful is because, on the one hand, when we talk about the state, we are talking about a nation state. We are talking about the Indian state, we are talking about the Pakistani state, we are talking about the Sri Lankan state, or we are talking about the Ethiopian state. When we talk about finance, finance is globalized. So you have a situation where international finance is facing a nation state. And as a result, international finance can bend the nation state to its will, because if the nation state does not do what it wants it to do, then international finance can simply, because it's globalized, can simply quit that country and therefore create a massive financial crisis in that country. Therefore, willy-nilly, whether you like it or not, nation states fall in line in order to do what finance or globalized finance wants them to do. And it's for this reason that you find that increasingly the state does the bidding of globalized finance. Tomorrow in India, suppose we remain committed to a regime of free financial flows, then tomorrow in India, even if the left comes to power, even if the Maoists come to power, you'll still find that you'll be doing exactly what finance wants to do. Because unless you change the regime, within that regime, the logic is one where you will have to do what they want you to do, otherwise they quit the country. So the point is that as long as you are stuck within that regime, and that is the regime of financial liberalization, that's the regime of globalization of finance. As a matter of fact, financial liberalization, you know how words get kind of used. Financial liberalization, which appears to be a lovely thing, liberalization, all of us would like to be liberal. Liberalized, financial liberalization is essentially a process of finance capturing the state. Why? Because if you say financial liberalization, that means finance can move around. Therefore, the state has to, as it were, bow to the spontaneity of finance. By spontaneity, I mean is self-driven characteristic. Finance can do what it likes, and the state has to bow to the whims and caprices of finance because of the fact that it's globalized, it's liberalized, and so the process of liberalization is nothing else but a process of finance capturing the state. Now, you know, it is amazing how you look at Greece. In Greece, the Greek state has lost the confidence of international finance. The Greek state, which is elected by the Greek people, which is supposed to be a sovereign constitutional entity, has lost the confidence of international finance, and that's the cause of the crisis. And now the solution to the crisis is suggested to be that the Greek state must recapture the confidence of international finance by squeezing the people, by imposing austerity measures. As a matter of fact, finance is not happy with the current government doing it. They are demanding that every political party in Greece must sign a memorandum whereby these austerity measures are agreed to by all of them, so that no matter who comes to power tomorrow, day after tomorrow, they'll all be doing exactly the same thing. So you can see how, with the process of globalization, with finance being international and the nation state still being a nation state, you actually have a reversal whereby the entire state tends to get captured by the corporate financial elite and to the exclusion of the influence of the other classes. I'll illustrate it with the Indian example later on. So, now that is something which therefore implies that the kind of support, the kind of defense, the kind of promotion that the state undertook in India and elsewhere in the third world in the post-decolonization period vis-a-vis petty producers is no longer possible. And that is the cause of the agrarian crisis, not only in India but elsewhere, and that's therefore also the cause of the food crisis. You find a situation where there is rampant and growing hunger in the world economy. And that's a very serious and major factor. The other crisis is also caused exactly by the same factor. How? because for a very long period, and just as we had a dirigist regime in countries like India, which was protecting and promoting petty production, we also have state intervention all over the capitalist world in what is called demand management. The period of the 1930s was a period, as you know, of acute unemployment. The capitalist world economy came out of this unemployment only because of the Second World War. When the Second World War happened, following the Second World War, you actually had the institutionalization of a regime of demand management. Let me just go a little bit into it. You know, as a matter of fact, in the 1930s itself, there was, or even before, there was a demand that, look, the state has to boost demand in the economy in order to increase employment in the midst of a recession. This was not agreed to by financial interests. Again, financial interests, as I said, always would like a situation where the state does things only to their liking and not necessarily does things which, as it were, are to the liking or in the interest or for the defense of the interests of the other classes, including the workers. So you had a situation where the state was, finance was opposed to state intervention in demand management. In the post-Second World War period, there was a certain change that took place in the balance of class forces within the advanced countries. Just as decolonization meant that once more a new regime came which was, as it were, there and had made certain promises to the people, you found that in the post-Second World War period, again, new governments came in a number of advanced capitalist countries which in fact could not go back to the thinking and the policies of the pre-war period. You may remember that Mr. Winston Churchill was the hero of... Okay, you see, the point is that suppose now everywhere in Southern Europe austerity measures are on. The impact of these austerity measures would be a reduction in world demand. If there is a reduction in world demand, there will be a reduction in the demand for Indian goods as well. Okay. At the same time, India too is imposing austerity. Isn't that so? If that is the case, then the demand reduction in India would be further compounded because it will consist of both demand reduction at the world level as well as our own demand reduction. And that being the case, quite clearly you would have that in India itself there will be much greater unemployment and much lower growth rates. Okay. And at the same time, there's another factor which I didn't. Okay, I mean, now that you have raised it, I may as well say. You see that suppose, as I was saying, you can reduce demand either through cutting incomes. Okay, I mean, you know, suppose 100 less demand is to be generated, you slash wages, you reduce demand. Or you keep wages the same and you raise prices. If you raise prices again, you reduce demand, cost push, increase in prices. In India now what we are doing, according to this latest budget, is that we are actually reducing demand, imposing austerity through inflation. Okay. When you impose austerity through inflation, what tends to happen is that, you know, that Indian goods at a given exchange rate would become more expensive compared to foreign goods. Okay. If that is the case, then India's current balance, current account deficit would become wider. In expectation of it becoming wider, people don't even wait until it becomes wider, you would have capital outflows taking place. If you have capital outflows taking place, then the government would be further constrained to reduce demand in order to induce greater confidence among financiers. Therefore, I see in the coming period, both because of the fact of the developments in the world economy, as well as the fact that austerity measures are being imposed domestically, as well as the fact that they are being imposed through cost-push inflation, I see a very drastic squeeze in the level of demand for the Indian economy, which will manifest itself in terms of greater unemployment and so on. If you want to avoid all this, okay, suppose you want to avoid all this, then what you have to do is, as I said, you have to free yourself from the movements of finance. You have to have capital controls. If you have capital controls, then you would be able to have enlarged government expenditure, not necessarily financed by fiscal deficit. It can be financed by taxes on the rich, but enlarged government expenditures, and if these enlarged government expenditures go towards supporting the peasantry, towards supporting agricultural sector, towards improving the state of rural life, improving rural development projects and so on, then you might also bring about an increase in food grain production. You can get into a virtuous cycle from the vicious cycle in which we are currently caught.
A couple of things. One is comment and second is question. In 2008, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, there was that was like earthquake. Even Finance Times from London wrote that capitalism in conversion, and I think that probably kind of led to some introspection among the capitalist thinkers. Kind of like Al Gore called for a sustainable capitalism, or Michael Barnier said that we need to go back to industrial capitalism. But when we contrast that to the situation in India, where relatively we didn't face that much scale of the crisis, I think that has led to a kind of euphoria among the Indian bourgeoisie that decoupling theory has worked and we are kind of isolated from any crisis in capitalism. So I think that kind of poses a kind of very deadly situation where Indian bourgeoisie has refused to draw any lessons from the crisis, or the crisis hasn't exposed the structural weaknesses of Indian economy. And I think as a reflection of that, in 2010, we saw government liberalizing petroleum and diesel prices, as well as FDI and retail. I think politically these were pretty bold decisions. So I think maybe Indian bourgeoisie has drawn strength from that situation. And I think this kind of builds up the contradiction to much larger scale, and India might lead to a very catastrophic situation. So that's what I think. Maybe I'd like to know your views. And second question is about the global thing. As we know, there is a considerable lag between objective situation and a working class reaction to the crisis. There have been big demonstrations, but there hasn't been any clear movement towards socialist alternative. So with that, looks like global capitalism may find its way out. So I would just like to know what could be the realignment of forces at the global level, that could kind of may help capitalism to somehow get out of this situation.
Yes, you're right. But as far as the first part of your thing is concerned, in the first place, suppose, imagine there are three different producers with different levels of unit costs. Suppose they fall in demand, then the ones with higher unit costs are more likely to be hit than the ones with the lower unit costs. Not surprisingly, therefore, that low-wage countries like India, China, and so on were less affected by the world recession than the high-wage countries, obviously. So, in fact, this was a recession in which the advanced countries were worse hit than countries like India, China, etc. But additionally, also, we should not underestimate the impact of the kind of fiscal stimulus measures that the government of China adopted and the government of India adopted, not as ambitious, but nonetheless some fiscal stimulus measures. Now, actually, what is going to happen is that these fiscal stimulus measures are being withdrawn. The process began in a small way in last year's budget, but they're going to gathering momentum in the current year's budget. And at the same time, at the world level, as I mentioned, the so-called Keynesian moment is now also being withdrawn. Now, if that is the case, then I think countries like India would be facing, I can't say about China because I don't know what fiscal stance they're going to adopt, but I think countries like India would be facing a more acute crisis now than they did earlier. Already there are signs of the growth rate slowing down, and this may well continue. And of course, one impact of that would be that, one can fall into the trap of arguing as follows. One can fall into the trap of saying that, listen, in the period when we are having 8% growth rate, it's not as if much employment was being created. And therefore, suppose the 8% becomes 4%, why should we cry? After all, if it didn't. But you see, it's not symmetrical in that sense. In other words, in a period of high growth, it may well be the case that not much employment is created. But this doesn't mean that if you have a sudden collapse of growth, unemployment would not increase. I hope I make myself clear. Okay, so the thing is that therefore, if you have a slowing down of the growth rate, this is certainly going to affect employment, particularly is going to affect a lot of the middle class employment. I think that's also related to your second question. You see, I think you are absolutely right. The capitalist crisis has not created any craving for socialism. Though, by the way, you'll be amazed to see that if you take an opinion poll in the United States, they don't call it socialism, but would you like a system other than capitalism? Say yes, yes, yes. So okay, socialism has got too associated in people's minds with what had happened in Eastern Europe and so on, and nobody wants to go back to that. I mean, you can debate about historically whether that played a role or not. I believe it played a major role in the defeat of fascism. I believe it played a major role in decolonization. Winston Churchill was totally opposed to India's independence. I mean, I think the kind of world correlation of forces favored decolonization. So historically, I think it played a major role. But that's not the same as wanting to go back to it. Okay. So I think nobody is too enthused about the idea of going back to socialism defined that way. But on the other hand, the fact that people are disillusioned with the existing system is something which is very clear. And I think this disillusionment is much stronger in the advanced countries than in India. In fact, I mean, things like Occupy Wall Street movement, it's a very small movement, but it's indicative of the mood among a lot of young people. While in India, you don't find the same thing. And I think one of the reasons behind that is that in India, the middle class has been doing quite well. Okay, they're doing quite well. And to the extent that the crisis gets generalized and the middle class ceases to do as well as it has been doing, you would find a much more radical response to the crisis in the coming years.
I just have one question. I'd like to ask, is it possible to totally eradicate the structural logic of capital in socialism? Or in other words, is it possible to go beyond capital itself in socialism?
Well, that's the whole idea of socialism. In other words, when I talk about socialism, you see, I see capitalism as a spontaneous system. By that I mean it's driven by its own inner tendencies. Okay. There was a period, that was what I was arguing, there was a period immediately in the post-war years, both in the Third World and in the First World, in which the state intervened to an extent to curb the immanent tendencies of capital, for instance, towards producing unemployment, etc., towards destroying petty production. But I think now we once more have a situation where globalization of finance and of capital in general, by enfeebling the state, is once more reasserting the realization of its immanent tendencies. Okay. Now, that being the case, because capitalism is a spontaneous system driven by its own inner tendencies, and those spontaneous systems give rise to the kind of crisis I've been talking about, the only way to overcome those kinds of crises is to go beyond capitalism. And when I say go beyond capitalism, I mean go beyond the immanent tendencies of capitalism. Those tendencies arise from the relationship of capital itself, capital-wage labor relationship, or pre-capitalist producers relationship, and so on. And therefore, I see socialism as a system that actually overcomes the immanent tendencies of capitalism by negating, by ensuring that those relations do not prevail as prevail under capitalism. Now, I think that is pretty clear. I mean, obviously, my notion of socialism is one where it's not a spontaneous system. In fact, the fundamental difference. My notion of socialism, for instance, would be one in which the socialist state protects the workers, not just the workers, but the peasantry as well. Protects all kinds of petty producers, does not let them go under. And of course, it does not do so by, as it were, forever apotheosizing petty production, but it does so, let us say, by building from that towards cooperatives, voluntary collectives, and so on. Okay, let me just make this clear. Since it's an important point, you see, peasant society, petty production is also the site of all kinds of reactionary features of our society. You have khap panchayats, you have a denial of the individual, you cannot marry according to your choice, you have a coercive dead weight of social pressure which is associated with the kind of so-called community that exists under petty production, caste system, and so on. Now the point is, the challenge before socialism in societies like ours is to, in fact, not distress the petty producers and let them become an impoverished lot. To defend their economic position by defending their position, the production structure they associated with it, but at the same time to change it. In other words, to change it by bringing about change from below. In other words, not you see, collective agriculture is not a destruction of the peasantry. Okay, I'm not talking about forced collectivization. Collective agriculture is an aggregation of the peasantry. So I see an aggregation, not a destruction. Okay, so I think these are very serious challenges. They are not very easy. Socialism, therefore, is not something which is a cakewalk. Socialism would be a very difficult thing to achieve, but on the other hand, since socialism, as Marx said, represents a transition from mankind's prehistory to history, the transition from a situation where we are caught in systems which drive us by their immanent tendencies, to systems in which we, through political control, in fact, determine our own economic destiny. And it's a major transition. That major transition is not an easy transition. Okay, all kinds of things come in the way, but on the other hand, that's the transition which is essential for human freedom, which is essential for overcoming crisis, which is essential for overcoming the material deprivation that is associated with the lives of vast numbers of people. So that's essential, but on the other hand, it's not easy. A second thing where socialism is not easy is the following. That you see, why do people work? Okay, in a feudal system, people work because if you don't work, you're whipped. Okay, the Monsignor's whip. In a capitalist system, you work because if you don't work, then out you go to the reserve army of labor, unemployment, which is why, by the way, the reserve army of labor is absolutely essential for the discipline of work in a capitalist society. In a socialist society, we are not going to have Monsignor's whip, we are not going to have the reserve army of labor, everybody must have complete security of employment. Therefore, the work motivation would have to be different. Okay. How do you prevent, how do you bring about that work motivation? How do you have a situation where people work because of the creativity associated with work, or because of the fact that it's part of being a social being that I work because, I don't want to be a free rider. So changing those motivations is an extremely difficult thing. Okay. So socialism is not a cakewalk, but on the other hand, I do not see any solutions to a whole range of problems facing mankind today within the existing structures of capitalism.
So my first question is about, in the year 1991, the Indian economy and the Chinese economy were around the $300 billion. But after the 2 decades of the LPG, the Chinese economy is beyond the $5,000 billion, and the Indian economy is still engulfed in $1,500 billion. Why we see such a huge contrast in the development of both economies? And another question, next question is, the Dunkel proposal and the WTO has proved troublesome for us, because after the accepting the Dunkel proposal and the WTO, there is a large increase in the suicide of the farmers. And next question is, our economy has become puppet in the hand of the global superpowers and the MNCs after the 1991. It is true or not?
Yes, of course it is true. I won't use words like puppet. Let's be very precise. I think we should be very precise. Okay, let's begin the other way. I'm not very impressed with the fact that the Chinese economy is much larger than India's. I'm not very impressed with the fact that China has a higher growth rate than India, because I believe that growth rate is a wrong criterion by which to judge an economy. I'd much rather judge the economy in terms of what is it doing to the living standards of the bulk of the population, of the working people. And I think in China also you find that there is a collapse of the public health system. In fact, they themselves say so. in the Chinese leadership, there's periodically they talked about socialist countryside. Okay, the whole idea was that really in the countryside, all kinds of facilities are non-existent. Some of them were there in the immediate post-revolutionary period, and then they were removed, and this is creating problems. Likewise, in India too. So I'm not very impressed by whether an economy is several times the size of another. I mean, I'd much rather go by what's happening to the ordinary people's lives. Okay. Now, it's obviously true that in China, the ordinary people's lives may be better. I'm not very sure. May be better than in India, because compared to India, nothing could be worse. Okay. But on the other hand, I'm not impressed by China in another way. I do not believe that a country should simply build up claims vis-a-vis another country. There's a neo-mercantilist strategy I'm talking about, as opposed to using those resources to improve the living conditions of its workers and peasants. In other words, if you have, let's say, 100 rupees worth of goods, you can do two things. Either you export those 100 rupees worth of goods to the US and hold claims against them, or you use those 100 rupees worth of goods to improve the living conditions of your workers and peasants. The former is what I call a neo-mercantilist strategy. The latter is what I would call a socialist strategy. Okay. So I'm not very impressed with the Chinese simply holding claims against the United States. I can understand some degree of insecurity all over East Asia. After the 1998 crisis, they all want to hold big reserves and so on. To some extent understandable, but continuously running a huge surplus vis-a-vis countries like the US and holding claims against them is a kind of neo-mercantilist strategy which I'm not very impressed with, and certainly not in accord with my notion of socialism. Okay. All right. Now, your second question is about, what has happened since 1991 and so on. Well, more precisely, what has happened since 1991 is that our economy is now open to financial flows, which basically means we don't have a convertible currency, but nonetheless, foreigners can bring in funds anytime they like and take out funds anytime they like. That being the case, it becomes very important for the country always to make sure that we retain their confidence so that they don't take out funds. By the way, they take out funds even when the fundamentals are pretty good, because otherwise, how do you explain the fact that one day, immediately after the crisis, for instance, in 2008, there was a huge outflow of funds from India. Why did that happen? Because there was a kind of panic all over the world. In fact, it's very interesting that that today you find that there is a rush to dollars. In 2008, again, you found there was a rush to dollars. You see, the dollar, even though the crisis was in America, the dollar is supposed to be as good as gold. So that you rush to dollars the way you rush to gold. Okay. So wealth holders at that time, and even now with the Eurozone crisis, feel more confident about holding dollars, and therefore they rushed to dollars even from rupees. Okay. So you had this situation where our economy is now open to financial flows. It's more open to trade flows, because of which you have a number of things. And one thing which has happened is that even though growth has picked up, and even though our service sector's exports have been quite high, employment generation has been less. Okay, let me just do it more precisely. Suppose you have a situation where the labor reserves do not get used up. I don't know, have you people read an article by Arthur Lewis called Unlimited Economic Development and Unlimited Supplies of Labor? Very simple article. Okay, the idea is very simple. Suppose, it's actually Marx's idea. So suppose you have a lot of labor reserves. Your wages are tied to a subsistence level. Alright, because there is no tightness in the labor market, your wages are more or less tied to the subsistence level. Any increase in labor productivity that takes place through growth necessarily accrues in a surplus. Am I making myself clear? So, an increase in inequality is built into it. Okay? It is not the nastiness of Manmohan Singh. It is not the nastiness of anybody. This is structural. You see, Now, if you want to overcome this, then the way to overcome it, of course, is to make sure that whatever growth you are having generates more employment. And how do you make sure that the growth generates more employment? By ensuring that the growth is accompanied by a smaller degree of technological and structural change. Am I making myself clear? This is what Gandhiji was talking about. You see, when Gandhiji was talking about precisely this. And you see, the point is that let us take a simple example, FDI in retail. FDI in retail is going to introduce a structural change into the economy, and that's going to generate unemployment. Okay, so, but if you don't have FDI in retail, if you continue with that kind of street corner shops and so on and so forth, at least those fellows will be getting some income instead of being completely unemployed. On the other hand, that also means that the structural change in the economy is kept in check. Okay, so one way in which you can actually have a greater impact on labor reserves is by having the kind of state intervention on the base of structural and technological change which neoliberalism does away with. Okay, so the inequalities which have arisen in India in the last few years, and of course together with it neoliberalism implies, as I said, the destruction or distress of petty production, which then adds to these labor reserves, etc., all of which generates increased absolute poverty. So the point I'm trying to make is that neoliberalism introduces the economy to a whole range of tendencies which therefore structurally mean an increase in inequality, an increase in poverty, even though you have high rates of growth. Okay, so that's the way I would put it. And of course, to the extent that you have to have the pursuit of such policies that finance doesn't flow out of your country, it basically means that all the time you're trying to keep them happy. And tomorrow, suppose it is the case that even you follow a foreign policy measure which the Americans don't like. In that case, Mr. Obama may make some comments about India which are not very complimentary. That may undermine the confidence of investors in the Indian economy, in which case they'll start taking their money out. You see, so in order to make sure that you retain their confidence, you continuously have to pursue a whole lot of measures, not only in economic policy, but even otherwise, whereby you are considered good guys.
Something that I want to understand is, you made a comment on the Indian state's promise to the peasantry, to the pre-independence time which carried forward.
Anti-colonial movements promise, because we didn't have an Indian state.
So anti-colonial movements promise to the Indian peasantry about some programs of their upliftment. And you say that after independence, the state did do such program, but it did not benefit people equally. So what I want to understand is, who are those who are benefited more equally in this program? That's just one point. The other is in your thought experiment of the so-called world state, where the world state would be again helping the peasantry and the petty producers. How do you do that kind of model work in a very hierarchized, patriarchal society? And hierarchized in the sense of caste.
I agree. In fact, that's exactly what I was saying. That that the challenge before any socialist movement is precisely this: that how you see traditional society, which is characterized by peasant agriculture, by petty production, also is characterized by a caste system, characterized by patriarchy, characterized by institutionalized inequalities, characterized by suppression of the individual, and so on. You know, in other words, it's a pre-modern society. So the point really, okay, capitalism, if it destroys this, simultaneously does not offer employment to the distressed peasants. That's the new situation. Since you have raised it, can I just go back a little? There is a view which is very common in the left and everywhere that, look, capitalism destroys the old society, reabsorbs those who are distressed and dispossessed by this into the modern proletariat. Okay. In fact, none other than Professor Amartya Sen, when in Bengal there was all that Nandigram and so on going on, had actually said that, look, London and Manchester were built by displacing peasants. So that, you know, the implicit suggestion is that, listen, this is part of historical progress. Okay, so don't shed tears, because this is inevitable. A certain transitional difficulty is inevitable in any historical progress associated with modernization. But my point is that it is not necessarily transition. As a matter of fact, those who are displaced in the West, say in Britain, those who are thrown out by the enclosure movements, those who are thrown out by the building of London and Manchester, were people who migrated to the temperate regions of white settlement. They migrated to the United States, Canada, drove off the Amerindians from their land and occupied that land. Okay. You'd be amazed by the extent of migration. Britain's population in 1810 was 12 million people. In the period between 1810 and 1914, 16 million British people just migrated to the temperate regions of white settlement, Australia, New Zealand, etc., etc. If you do a similar scale of migration, then between independence and today in India, 400 million people should have migrated. Okay, that's the scale. It's not possible today. As a result, roots of that kind, so anything, you know, the fact that it happened historically does not mean that it is immanent to capitalism, that it will always find a solution for the distressed producers by absorbing them into the proletariat. That's precisely what is not happening. If it is not happening, then it seems to me that we have to have an alternative system in which these producers are not displaced, but nonetheless, the reactionary society of which they are a part is something which is altered in other ways. Okay. Patriarchy, caste system, etc. has to be broken without necessarily throwing out millions of peasants from their existing occupations. That is the challenge for socialism. Then the and I don't believe it is not even. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible. On the contrary, I believe it's possible, which is why I believe that socialism is possible. Your other question, I'm sorry, can you just repeat?
It was about the thought experiment. In the thought experiment that you were.
Oh, in the thought experiment.
The other one was about this Indian promise of pre-independence.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, right. Okay. You see, let me just make one thing clear, that a part of the promise was actually violated, and that is the part relating to land to the tiller. There were no land reforms carried out. Okay. All that is well. But a part was not violated. And that is something which basically meant protect, you know, because the peasantry had been exposed to world price fluctuations. It was completely protected from world price fluctuations in this entire period, right until the beginning of this century, when we did away with quantitative restrictions on agricultural trade. Now, the point is that obviously the beneficiaries were the rich peasants, and the landlords, to the extent that we became capitalists. I think some of the old feudal zamindars and so on in UP may have suffered because of the land reforms that took place. Suffered means they were compensation, but they lost their particular social position. But on the other hand, the capitalist landlords, the whole Indian land reforms were ones that actually pressurized landlords to become capitalists. Okay, so they were beneficiaries. The rich peasants who became capitalists were beneficiaries. But I would say not only these, I mean, even other sections of the peasantry, to the extent that, let's say, you have irrigation being introduced into a particular area, yields increase, output increases, then there will be some more beneficiaries. They are not just confined to the capitalist segments, there will also be beneficiaries who actually go further down. So you had, as it were, a differentiated distribution of benefits. Okay. But on the other hand, now what is happening is that the entire rural area, by the way, the suicides are not confined only to the destitute in the sense of very poor peasants and so on. I mean, even others who may have introduced tube wells, but find that they have done so on the basis of a loan, crop has failed. So suicides are not necessarily only of very poor people. So you find now, therefore, there is a kind of more widespread, more pervasive attack on petty production than simply the very poor peasants, etc. Okay. That's what I was trying to say. Which is why I'm not, I mean, my fundamental point is the difference in the way we used to look at Indian agriculture in the 50s, 60s and 70s and the way we look at Indian agriculture now. There were never suicides. There were never suicides. Yesterday I was actually in Patiala and I mean the Vice Chancellor of the university was saying, what is this? I don't understand. In Punjab, suicide is unheard of. Because a Punjabi can, he can be a shaheed, he can be a martyr, but he doesn't kill himself out of desperation. See? So there's really, it's major culture shock. Something very important is happening. I mean, I don't know if my speech, my understanding captures it or not, but I hope you people could try and work on this. But I think something very important is happening in our society and it must be understood.
I have two small questions. One is regarding, I've been talking about the agricultural crisis, and many advocates of the FDI in retail have been saying that actually it will help the farmers. That is, what is your counter argument to this? And another question is, have we reached the stage of, say, when we are talking of the autonomy of the nation states? Have we completely lost that opportunity, and is there any escape route, or is it virtually irreversible?
Yeah, I think, okay. The first one is not really serious. It's just an argument they use to kind of sell the idea. But just imagine, if you have a monopoly, a gigantic buyer, pitted against vast numbers of small sellers, then the sheer inequality of bargaining strength is such that it is absurd to imagine that the small sellers would actually be better off. As a matter of fact, studies in other countries like Thailand and so on which have done this also show that actually they have suffered as a result of this. So the first one is just a sales talk. The second one is a very important question, extremely important question. In fact, now that you raise it, I may as well take you into confidence. That a lot of people in the European left, for instance, this philosopher Zizek. Yeah, you see, Zizek had come to Cochin for the festival. A lot of people of the European left, like Zizek and so on, I had spoken and Zizek was there. They object strongly to the idea of nations delinking. In other words, you're going to have a world state, okay? In which case, the struggle of workers and peasants in India would simply have to take the form of changing the nature of the Indian state. Okay, you don't have an international working class movement, you don't have an international peasant movement, and therefore the movements which are there, such as they are movements which are confined to the boundaries of particular nations. Therefore, if these movements are successful, then of course their success would take the form of changing the nation state of that particular nation. Changing the nation state from one which is captured by finance capital to one which is a state of workers and peasants, okay, which is sensitive to the interests of workers and peasants. That's the way we have to think of social change in societies like ours in the foreseeable future. That is not where we stay, because after all, ultimately the aim of any socialist would be mankind as a whole. In fact, you cannot even have survival in just one country over a long period of time of such an isolated, even progressive nation state. You can withstand, like Cuba has withstood sanctions for a very long time, but ultimately it begins to tell. I think the viability of any such socialism that remains confined to one or two nations, even large nations, is something which in the long run gets undermined. But nonetheless, that's the way that we in India, for instance, think in terms of social transformation. Alright? Nobody, most progressive opinion in India would think in terms of a national agenda around which you can mobilize workers and peasants for a social transformation in the context of the nation, within the geography of the nation, in order to bring about a change in the nature of the nation state, class nature of the nation state. People like Zizek get very upset with this because they say that, listen, they say exactly what you are saying, that the nation is passive. The nation is potentially a reactionary thing. A nation produces chauvinism, a nation produces, that basically the left has to go beyond nations. Okay. I agree with them. In fact, I have a lot of sympathy for that position. But the only thing is that I believe that between imperialist internationalism, which is what globalization is, okay, which is at the expense of the people, and socialist internationalism, there may be a transitional period when you withdraw from internationalism. Not out of choice, but out of necessity.
Some scholars tend to suggest that the market-led land reforms or opening of land markets might benefit the poor and the landless. So I would like to know your views on it and whether you see any possibility of that happening in India.
But can you tell me how it can? In other words, you see, when you say land reforms to the market, it basically means that I have got money, I go and get land. All right. I exchange one asset for another. The whole point of land reforms is to provide assets to the assetless, not simply for one asset to be exchanged for another asset, because that presupposes distribution only among those who have assets. Okay. So I don't know.